So welcome to the first webinar for our virtual Congressional Visits Day. You all know me, I'm Kelsey, I'm the Bacall Fellow, and we also have with us today Joel Perriott, the Policy Director for the AAS, who will be chiming in throughout the presentation. Joel, do you want to say hi?
Hello. Glad
Okay.
that everyone can be here.
So I kind of split up all the introductory material over two presentations. What I hope to achieve through the webinar series is getting you all of the material you would have had in that day and a half of training before your visit, but spreading it out so that it's in smaller pieces because Zoom is exhausting. So this is the first part of the introduction, which is going to focus mostly on kind of like the vocab that you're gonna need to know for the rest of our discussions. So I'm gonna talk about advocacy and what your options are as someone working in the astronomical sciences. And then we're gonna do like a US government basics with a focus on Congress, because that's who you're gonna be interacting with for your virtual visits, which will really be Zoom calls or phone calls. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Public Policy Department as a way for members of the AAS to get involved. We've kind of a two-part job, which is communicating between the astronomical community and the government in both directions. So we need to keep the membership of the AAS informed about what's happening in DC that might impact their ability to do science, and also any resolutions that are coming down from the board of the AAS that might be aimed at the state of the profession and things like that, action items. And then we take how the members of the AAS are feeling and we send that information back to the government. So we keep them informed on what's happening in the astronomical sciences. And we even take that one step farther to do advocacy, which is making sure that our science policy priorities are getting across in addition to just the cool, fun science we're doing. So I'm going to expand on advocacy as something that you all can be and will be and are involved in by doing this Congressional Visits Day. So first I want to say that in doing this, you're not a lobbyist, and Joel and I are not officially lobbyists because we mostly do advocacy. So the difference between lobbying and advocacy, a lobbyist would go in and point to a specific piece of legislation and say, because I work for this company, I want you to do these things. And an advocate will go in and say, I know that this legislation exists and I want to talk about some of the issues that are important to me. So that is more the kind of thing that you'll be doing. You don't even need to point to a specific piece of legislation. Normally during Congressional Visits Day, we have it so that you can talk to your representatives about appropriations, but it's a little late for that. So you'll mostly be just talking to them about things that are important to you during this visit. So you, as a private citizen, volunteering your time, you don't have to worry about somehow being a lobbyist. I assure you, you're not. You're just participating in advocacy. Also, some more distinctions to make. We just distinguish between advocacy and lobbying. There's a difference between policy for science and science for policy. So you've probably heard me say a bunch of times just science policy in general. That can go both ways. So there's policy that impacts scientific research, and then there's research that informs policy. So something like climate change, that's continually in a feedback loop. Something like the astronomical sciences, we're mostly concerned with the policies that are going to be impacting our science. So I mentioned, in addition to talking to the government and relaying that information back to the community. Since we're focused on communicating so much, it's really important that we're on top of how the astronomical community feels about issues. So Congressional Visits Day is one of the ways that you all, as members of the community, can interact with the policy process. There's also the Decadal Surveys. There's 3 of them for our fields. There's the astronomy and astrophysics, the heliophysics, and the planetary science decadals. And all of those are, the committees and panels are all populated by members of our community. And then now, in addition to the decadal surveys, which happen once a decade, we have mid-decadals. So there's even more opportunities to hear feedback from the community. There's also the Committee on Astronomy and Public Policy through the AAS and advisory committees. And those committees are all populated by members of our community. So I want to focus on the Committee for Astronomy and Public Policy first, because that's very closely tied to the Public Policy Department at the AAS. So Joel and I are staff members of the AAS. So we make up the Public Policy Department at the AAS. If you wanted to volunteer your time to work on public policy issues, you could join CAP, which is, you're not a staff member of the AAS, you're a volunteer member of the society participating on one of the committees. So the mission of that committee is to support policies that are good for US astronomical sciences. Sometimes we also get involved with some international science, astronomical science policy issues. A recent one to come across our desks/laptops was space mining. So some things like that come up every now and then. So CAP regularly discusses whatever the current developments are in science policy, and then they work on informational advocacy initiatives. An example of that would be writing a letter to Congress or signing on to one that maybe a large number of societies are all signing on to make a statement about science policy. So any AAS member can volunteer to be on CAP. This is a good way to feel like you're participating without necessarily pursuing a full-on career in science policy. Your membership will need to be approved, and the term is 1 year from AAS summer meeting to AAS summer meeting. So the decadal surveys are another way that we collect community input. This is probably one of the most important ways that we I mean, it's all important, but this one carries the most heft to it because we only do these every 10 years. It's conducted by the National Academies, which is considered the best third-party objective policy judger for science policy. And they conduct these surveys to determine what the top priorities are going to be for the 3 fields I mentioned before, astro, helio, and planetary, for the next decade. And then based on those priorities is how we decide what our new big expensive facilities are going to be. So this ends up dictating how the agencies that pay for things like grants and missions and facilities spend a lot of their money. As of 2010, we also, in addition to thinking about science priorities, we added state of the profession as part of the surveys. So we're also thinking about the health of the field for the people who do the science. There's the structure is that there's a steering committee which has 2 chairs, and they're the ones that the steering committee is the group that will make the final report, but they are being assisted by several panels which are each assigned a more specific research or state of the profession area to look at. And
I'll
so
say they don't always have 2 chairs. Sometimes there's just 1.
Okay, right now we have 2 chairs.
Right. And both the planetary and astro.
And right now there's, yeah, the planetary and the astro decadals are happening right now. So the astro decadal's been happening for over a year now. The planetary decadal is just getting set up at the moment. So the staff of the national academies are trying to organize finding volunteers. So they come up with a list of people that they think it would be good to ask to serve, and then they need to hear back from all those people, and then all of those people need to be approved by the president of the national academies. So this process takes a pretty long time to set up all these committees and panels. But they are populated, again, by members of our community. So that final report that comes out of the decadal survey is that is the key justification for the money that the agencies are going to be spending on really the big expensive projects, but also medium-sized and smaller projects, and all of the proposals and research grants that are going to come off of that. It's a really big deal. And so when we're looking at appropriation season, deciding how Congress is going to spend money within the agencies, and when they're pointing to specific projects within the agencies, it's very common to cite what the decadal said about that project and how important it was. And then the mid-decadals are only there to assess the progress. They don't ever add new priorities or change the priorities. So once those priorities are set, they stick for 10 years.
So this one, the current Astro one and planetary are long in the tooth, because new ones are coming out soon. So
I had also mentioned advisory committees as a way to get involved, but I'm going to come back to that after I've told you a little bit about the structure of the US government, because those advisory committees are designed to advise the agencies. So let's talk about those first. So I'm going to start going over your US Gov 101 lesson. So there are many policymakers that you could be interacting with. If you're doing science policy advocacy, you could be interacting with the White House, also known as the administration. You could be interacting with your elected representatives, whether they're in the House or Senate, or local elected representatives. There's the people who work for the members of the House and Senate. So there's congressional staffers. They might work in the personal offices. They might serve on, work for committees that the members of Congress sit on. And usually, we'll talk about staffers in a little bit. So depending on where the staffer is positioned, whether they work in a House office, a Senate office, or on a committee, it'll require varying degrees of expertise in whatever they're supposed to be providing assistance and knowledge on. And then there's also the agencies themselves, which are full of administrators making sure everything's functioning. And in doing so, they are establishing policies. For instance, NASA and soon NSF switching to double-blind peer review is an example of agency policy. So speaking of NASA and NSF, there are three agencies that we deal with a lot in the astronomical sciences. There's more than these three, but these are the three biggest. So there's NASA, and inside NASA, there's the Science Mission Directorate and the Office of STEM Education. Within the Science Mission Directorate, there is astronomy, helio, and planetary, and then there's also earth science, which we mostly don't interact with very much. The National Science Foundation, there's the Mathematical and Physical Sciences Division, within which is AST, which is the Astronomy and Astrophysics Division. There's MREFC, which stands for Major Research Equipment and Facilities Construction. So this is where the big projects like the Vera C. Rubin Observatory get funded out of. So that final decadal report, if it recommends a big flagship ground-based facility, that'll be built by the NSF. If it recommends a big space-based facility, that'll be built by NASA. And then the Department of Energy has an Office of Science, which is in itself it's like an agency within an agency. It's very large, and we have a very small piece of it that we sometimes get funding and projects out of. So part of the Office of Science is the High Energy Physics Division, and then within that is the Cosmic Frontier program. And so things like dark energy survey cameras will be designed and built inside that DOE Office of Science facilities.
And I'd say Office of Science also has, for people that do big simulations, they have a big high performance computing.
High performance computing, yeah.
Is the name, it's ASCRS, the acronym, but that's where all the big supercomputers on the civilian side are funded out of, at Energy.
So those advisory committees, you might also hear them called advisory groups, although usually advisory groups tend to have a more specific focus. So there's the Astronomy and Astrophysics Advisory Committee, which advises NSF, NASA, and DOE on priorities having to do with astronomy and astrophysics, and it's populated by volunteers from across the community with many different expertises, so they can speak to all the projects at NSF, NASA, and DOE. Something like an advisory group would be the Exoplanet Advisory Group, which advises NASA's Planetary Science Division. So that's significantly more specific. So yeah, their job is to advise the agencies on what the professional communities want to see from the agency. So this could be specific to the science, for instance, concerns about funding for the scientists themselves. That's that RNA funding, which has been an issue for NASA's Planetary Science Division. They can also speak to issues along the lines of state of the profession. So they can strongly recommend that agencies start to implement dual anonymous peer review more widely. They cover all kinds of topics. And it is all volunteers, just like CAP, except instead of interacting within the AAS, they're interacting with the agencies. And they usually have multiple meetings a year that are open to the public. So if you're interested in something like this, maybe you want to volunteer, maybe you're just curious about what they do, what they talk about at their meetings, you can look them up and see when their next meeting is and watch it online. There's a lot of different advisory committees and advisory groups. So I recommend just typing, if you can ask me for help looking up one that covers a topic you're interested in, or you can try doing some research on your own to find them. Okay, so we covered agencies. Now we're going to move on to the White House / the administration / the executive office of the president. So these are the people who work directly for the president, and it is their job to execute the president's agenda. That doesn't mean they were all personally hired by the president. A lot of employees who work in this area carry over from administration to administration, and they tend to be, they're very well informed. So when we get to the budget numbers later, you might think they're evil, but they're not. So there's the Office of Management and Budget. They work with the agencies to lay out the president's vision of what the budget should be for the country. So we're going to go over the fiscal year cycle, and you'll see that they come in very early in the process. Then there's the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So one of their main jobs is to assist the president in drafting executive orders that have to do with science and technology policy. So most laws come out of Congress, but the president does have some power to issue executive orders that immediately come into effect as the law, unless they're challenged in court. the issue with executive orders, why that isn't some kind of amazing all-powerful power, is because whenever the next president comes in, it's very easy for them to undo executive orders. And then there's the National Space Council. So these are the people who work on what the direction of the US space program should be, such that it aligns with the president and right now very much so the vice president's vision for the US space program. So if you've seen the news around space policy at all in the last 4 years, it's been very human exploration heavy, and there's been a lot of back and forth between the president and the vice president about where we should be exploring. So now I'm going to move on to Congress. So there's the House and Senate. The House has 435 members. The Senate has 100 members. So there's a lot more representatives than there are senators. That makes sense. There's a representative for every district in the US, and there's just only 2 senators per state. The representatives only have 2-year terms, whereas senators have 6-year terms. So representatives aren't necessarily around for as long. They have a shorter amount of time before they can be elected out of office. So there's a much higher turnover for representatives than for senators. And that also means there's a higher turnover of their staff. So when you're going to your meetings and you're making connections, just keep that in mind, that if you are able to establish a long-term connection with your representative's office, that relationship might not last more than a couple of years. You will need to pay attention to who your representative is, because that will change more quickly than your senator. I mean, you should always be paying attention to both. Also, the representatives' offices, they have less staff, so they have the same number of issues to cover, just as wide a variety, but they need to do with less staff, which means if you're talking with a staff member in a representative's office, they won't be as specialized in science or education policy. They may cover a whole slew of other things like agriculture and veterans affairs, who knows? Whereas if you meet with a staffer from the Senate, it's more that they tend to have more staffers in their offices, so it's more likely that the staffer you're meeting with will be more specialized and a bit more informed on your issue. Either way, you should always make sure you give introductory information to the person you're meeting with, because you don't know how much they're going to know going into the meeting. So things that a member of Congress cares about are the media, their personal convictions, aka the issues, and their district, or in the case of senators, their state. With the issue of their district, obviously their own district comes first, but there have been a few cases in my personal meetings with offices where the neighboring district was also very pertinent to what we were talking about. So for instance, I met with a representative from Florida where I was talking to them about space policy, and they said they loved NASA, not because there was a NASA center in their district, but because there was a manufacturing plant that built things that were used by NASA. So NASA created jobs in their district without necessarily having a immediate presence there. So I just want to show you a couple diagrams about the diversity of views in Congress. So if you look along the x-axis, you'll notice there's a that's the economic views from liberal to conservative of Congress. There's a pretty sharp divide there. But if you look at the y-axis, which covers everything else, there's a pretty even distribution. There's no sharp break. And this is for the representatives. If you look at the Senate, it's the same thing. So if you're going into one of these meetings, just because you know you're meeting with a Democrat or Republican, that's not enough information. You shouldn't like brace yourself either way for the meeting, just knowing that, because Democrats and Republicans fall across a wide range of the spectrum for everything other than economics. So the two most important powers of Congress are that they control the money. So as you'll see in a minute when I get to the budget cycle, Congress gets the final say on the money the government is spending. So that is the appropriations process that I've mentioned a couple times, and that we had hoped to be more involved with when we were originally planning to have this Congressional Visits Day in the spring. That process is still going on right now, but it's a little late to be giving the type of input we would have given in the spring. Also very important is that Congress writes the law, and part of those laws are the authorizations of the agencies. So Congress had, all the agencies were written into existence by Congress. So they create the agencies, and then those authorizations, usually it's not a one and done law. They need to be renewed regularly, preferably, well, they usually are set to only last for 1 year, which means you would expect them to be renewed every year. It's better if they last if they're set to last for more than 1 year, because that gives the agency a bit more stability. Usually they write it to last 1 year and then they don't renew it for a couple of years, because it takes a long time to write these things. Because when they reauthorize the agency, they are directing them to function in that authorization. So if the priorities have changed for that agency or any of its programs, then a lot of discussions need to be had about how do you write the new version of the authorization. So there's, within Congress, I mentioned there were these committees. So there are committees for the authorizing, and there are committees for appropriations. So the astro-relevant appropriations committee on both the House and Senate is the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee. And you can see there they each have, so they have a chair and a ranking member. The chair will be from the party that's in control, and the ranking member will be from the minority party, the majority and the minority. So in the House, the Republicans are the majority. So Roy Adderholt is the chair of the CJS subcommittee for appropriations, and Jose Serrano is the ranking member.
No,
and
you mean the reverse.
Oh, yep, sorry. In the Senate, the Republicans are the majority. In the House, the Democrats are the majority. Sorry. So yeah, let me say that again. Jose Serrano is the chair of CJS subcommittee, and Roy Adderholt is the ranking member. And then when we go over to the Senate side, because the Republicans are the majority, Jerry Moran would be the chair and Jeanne Shaheen would be the ranking member.
The other thing is, for the Department of Energy, they have different different appropriations committees.
Yeah, it's energy and water.
And for like CFA, Smithsonian, that's in the Interior Department. Appropriation. Defense is obviously in defense. So but these are the two biggies for NSF and NASA and NIST.
Yeah. And then going to authorizing committees. So you might have noticed that for appropriations, the title of the subcommittee is exactly the same in the House and the Senate. We're going to get to that in a minute, the structure of the appropriations committees, but that is purposeful that those are identical. It does not need to be exactly the same for authorizing committees. So in the House, it's the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and in the Senate, it's the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. So within those authorizing committees, there are subcommittees. So there's just a couple here, but there are plenty of subcommittees, and you should check to see if your representative sits on any of them. Some examples of subcommittees on the House side are the Research and Tech Subcommittee and the Space Subcommittee. And examples on the Senate side are Aviation and Space Subcommittee. And so that would be NASA, Science, Oceans, Fisheries Subcommittee would cover NSF. And so for the overall committee, authorizing committee, on the House side, Eddie Bernice Johnson is the chair and Frank Lucas is the ranking member. And on the Senate, it's Roger Wicker is the chair and Maria Cantwell is the ranking member.
Oh, I see one typo there. The Frank Lucas is Oklahoma.
Thank you. Oops, I can't edit it right now. But yeah, that's important to note. Okay, so I keep talking about appropriations, and now we're going to finally get to that in the rest of the public budget cycle. So the federal budget process, it looks complicated at first glance, but we're going to break it down. So if the first thing I want you to notice is that at the bottom we have FY 2020 and FY 2021. That stands for fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021. And then I have the calendar years lined up with the months the way you would expect them to be. So 2019, 2020, and 2021. The fiscal years do not line up with the calendar years. So the fiscal years run October to September. And so right now, that we're at the beginning of September, we're very close to the end of fiscal year 2020 and very close to the beginning of fiscal year 2021. So in blue, we have agency involvement in creating the budget. So the agencies do get a chance to have a say on what's going to happen with the money that will be given to them. And they work with the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the President's administration, to create a budget that fits both the agency's desires and the president's vision for how money would be spent in the country. What that means is usually these budgets are skinny. They usually are full of cuts to programs, and the agencies work with OMB to figure out if there needs to be cuts, where should those be going? And in red is the release of that budget that they spent all that time working together on. And so that is the release of the president's budget. So it gets called the president's budget, but all the work was done by the Office of Management and Budget and the agencies.
The agencies are also executing the budget. So at any one time, they've got 3 or 4 years they're keeping track of.
Yeah. Joel used to work at the Office of Management and Budget, so he knows all about this process.
After we were growing budgets.
Okay. After the president's budget is released, which is supposed to happen in February, then Congress has a budget resolution and hearings to draw input from the outside community. The hearings are for drawing input from the outside community. So for example, if there was proposed big cuts to NASA or something, there might be a hearing that invited someone high-ranking from NASA, and then also maybe some scientists from the fields that are going to be worst impacted, or if it was human exploration, maybe some people who had worked in that. They want to bring in experts to hear what they have to say. And they also want to invite the agencies to talk out loud about why they wrote the budget they did. So when the budget gets released, in addition to just stating what it's going to be, they also have to release a congressional justification, but sometimes Congress has more questions beyond the information that's given to them in that document. So with the budget resolution, they also decide what is the total amount of money they're going to give themselves to spend for the next year. And then they have to break that down into 12 chunks. So there will be 12 appropriations bills, and within those 12 subcommittees that each are going to come up with an appropriations bill, each subcommittee is overseeing a huge chunk of the US government and the country's ability to function. So for instance, Commerce, Justice, Science, they have to cover NASA, NSF, a whole bunch of other science agencies, and that's just the science part. They also have things like the census and our whole justice system in there. So it's a truly monstrous task for them to go through this process. So I have some diagrams outlining what I just talked about in case it didn't really make sense the first time. So here we have the administration bubble. Within them, we have the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy has taken the president's vision for science and technology in the US and translated it into something that the Office of Management and Budget can use to create fiscal divides between what priority is going to get X amount of money. And then the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has to work with the agencies, communicating back and forth on what will the agency's budget end up looking like in the budget request. So that budget request goes out, it goes to the legislative branch, Congress, and Congress has been working on their budget agreement. So that's the total amount of money they have to spend. And then they divvy that up across 12 appropriations bills. So you saw that there were the same named subcommittees for appropriations in the House and Senate. That's because it's the same 12 subcommittees on the House and Senate. They have to each come up with their set of numbers on how the money should be spent, and then they have to come to an agreement. So you'll see in a few of the charts coming up that their initial numbers that they put out don't necessarily agree. And so they have to come to an agreement or the budget won't be passed. So what's likely to happen, since we are so close to the end of the fiscal year and coronavirus has been happening and they're stuck on stimulus packages for coronavirus, and so the budget process has been slowed down, is that they're not going to be able to come to an agreement by the end of this month. Hopefully they come to an agreement on the stimulus package. So what that means is if they want the government to keep functioning without having said how much money the government is allowed to spend, they can pass a continuing resolution, which is this CR block that is shown up here. And that means they basically just put the government on autopilot and they say whatever our spending profile was for the previous year, so the one we're in right now, FY 2020, we're just going to keep doing that until we figure out what we're going to do for next year. So since it's an election year, it's very likely that we will get a continuing resolution until at least after the election, possibly longer. That is definitely better than having a full-on government shutdown, which is when they can't reach an agreement and they also don't pass a continuing resolution. And as you saw a couple of years ago, everything shuts down. So that's definitely worse than a continuing resolution. So there's different points at which this process can fail. Right now, we have the 12 bills from the House. We don't have them from the Senate. So it can fail at this point because the Senate hasn't even come out with their numbers yet. It could be that they get to conference by the end of the month, but they aren't able to pass all 12 bills, so it would fail at that point. After they come to an agreement on all 12 bills for conference, all of that gets sent to the president's desk and the president has to sign it into law. So you might have heard in the news for the past couple of years, the president threatening to not sign the the bills into law and thus shut down the government. Why do we care about this process? Why do we care how much money the government is spending on the agencies and thus on science? Well, that's because, as you can see here in blue, the federal government pays for a lot of the basic research that is done in the US, and they also pay for a lot of the applied research. So if for some reason they decided to stop paying for science, we would be in a lot of trouble. So they can't just take any money they want and spend it on science. Part of the budget has to be dedicated to mandatory expenditures, and then almost all of our science funding is going to come out of discretionary. And so as a percentage of our GDP, it looks like that discretionary line that we're getting our money from has been going down. Well, it has been going down, but in terms of dollar amounts, that's actually been going up. So glass half empty, glass half full, I guess. So within that discretionary spending, the money that goes towards science isn't necessarily all going towards our science. You can see here several of the different types of research that the government spends money on outside of defense research. So health is a huge one. And I think especially with coronavirus, that line is set to grow. Space has consistently been a place where the government has invested a lot of money ever since the space program started. Energy, natural resources, general science, and other are also some of the categories. So if we look at what happens as we step through that fiscal year cycle that I just showed you, we get the president's request, and then we hear from the House, and then we hear from the Senate, and then we have a conference which leads to the final amounts. So you can see these yellow lines are what we usually hear about first. Well, pretty much we always hear about this first, and that's the president's request, and it's consistently cutting back on the budget. And then it'll go to Congress, and Congress will usually put the money back into the budget. So here you can see it's almost always in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, not down at planetary science. And that also, so like for instance, this top for the NASA science total, the House increased it by 4%, the Senate did 0%, the conference amount was 3%. So it didn't necessarily end up that the House won or the Senate won, or that they just did a 50-50 split. There's a lot of negotiating happening in this process so that the numbers, the final numbers, it's not super straightforward. There's no formula you can just apply every time to find those conference final numbers. Here's an example of where there were cuts across the board, and the reason for that is motivated by something that's not bad necessarily. So just because something is getting cut doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. So for MREFC, normally with budget lines, you want to see slow and steady increases. With MREFC inside the NSF, they actually just fund things as they have projects. So if a project is winding down and doesn't need to be funded anymore, then their budget line goes back down. And then when they start a new project, their budget line goes way back up. So that's what we're seeing here is the end of the Vera C. Rubin construction, and also the end of the Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope construction. So looking forward to 2021, which is the next year's next fiscal year, there are once again many cuts from the administration. We do have the House numbers now. AIP just hasn't released an updated diagram yet. They did put most of the money back in. I can tell you that they basically left it as flat from the previous year. So the house numbers will be very close to the bar for all of these. So something to keep in mind when you're going into your visits is generally basic research is something that both Democrats and Republicans support, especially astronomy and things having to do with space. Both sides, it has captured their imagination, especially the Event Horizon Telescope discovery last summer really gave us a huge boost in overall approval for space studies. However, they are dealing with tight budget constraints. I mean, we're competing against the census and the Justice Department and ourselves across the different science agencies. So it's a very hard job that they have to come up with the right combination of funding, and these conversations that you're going to be having could end up having a big impact on a program, because when you get down to the specific program that you care about, maybe $1 million makes a huge difference, but that's a rounding error in the overall budget. So you being involved in advocacy like this does have a significant impact on the policies and the funding that will be impacting your research. So totally, we're really glad to have you here, and thank you for participating despite the global pandemic. And next time we're going to get into more specifically what you'll talk about during your visit, because that's normally the big focus would be on appropriations, but because we're in the fall now and there's a pandemic happening, it's going to be a little different this time. So I'm going to give you all some ideas of other things you can talk about. And we'll also be providing you all with a leave behind document that you can send in your thank you email after your meetings. And that'll have information about appropriations in it. So you won't necessarily have to worry about this as much during your actual meeting, but it is like the bread and butter of science policy work. So it's a good thing to be aware of. That's the end.
Kelsey, did you want to give the folks that could be here opportunity to say anything, or?
Yeah, I definitely want you all to ask questions.
If nobody has questions, I'd like to, at least we could turn off the recording and then just do, introductions. But
okay. Does anyone have any questions? All right, in that case, I'll stop the recording.
Turn off the recording and then we'll do introductions.